Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave and a new video on pre-Socratic philosophy. I ended the last video on a somewhat pessimistic tone. We have seen an amazing gallery of highly intelligent and creative pre-Socratic philosophers. Each was a genius in his own right, and all were trying to understand the world better. But sadly, they also all disagreed, and there was no clear path forward. Are we just supposed to learn all of these contradictory and mutually exclusive theories? If we wait another 20 or 50 or 100 years, will the number of theories just keep growing without ever reaching a conclusion? And in this uncertainty steps Protagoras of Abdera, as perhaps the first of a new school of thought, the Sophists, also known as the older Sophists. Now, Sophists have gotten a bad rap, especially because of... we'll get to that. But before you form your negative opinion about Sophists in general, or Protagoras in particular, let's have a closer look at who he was and what he believed. Protagoras lived from about 490 to 420 BC, which places him right on top of folks like Zeno, Empedocles and Leucippus, and makes him a slightly older contemporary of Democritus and Socrates. He was born in Abdera in Thrace, which, if you remember, was also the hometown of Democritus, the second and more famous atomist we met in the previous video. There is a story about these two philosophers meeting, namely that one day Protagoras was walking with a stack of wood tied together neatly with a very short piece of rope. When Democritus saw him, he believed that he was a mathematician in the rough, and taught him math and philosophy. Though this likely is not a true story, not least because Democritus was likely some 30 years younger, I thought it was fun to share. Later, Protagoras went to Athens and made some powerful friends there, including Pericles. This Pericles, who was a famous Athenian politician, apparently entrusted Protagoras with drafting a new constitution for a colony in Thurii in southern Italy. Protagoras writing a constitution for a new city? Put a pin in that. At the same time, he traveled all over Greece as a teacher, and he allegedly made a lot of money this way. This sounds rather innocuous, as we've already seen a few students and pupils, but those kinds of relationships tended to be either much more informal or perhaps more of an intern being trained up to take over the shop. Here the purpose seems to have been much more of an economic exchange, the service of lessons in exchange for money. One of the things he taught was teach wealthy Athenians how to successfully file and defend themselves in a lawsuit. In Athens, people would frequently sue each other over all sorts of things, and since basically everyone had to defend themselves in court, it was important that you were able to craft a good legal argument to defend yourself. Put a pin in that too. He also wrote books. A lot of books about a lot of different topics. Like one book was called Truth, another was called On the Gods, and also one, which seems to have been about the art of debating, was called Opposing Arguments. Besides those, he also wrote about topics like art, sports, science, and law, to name just a few topics. However, as is often the case, all of these works are now lost, and we only have about a handful of authentic quotes from him. Speaking of lost works and having little data, let me also, for the record, note that almost everything we know about Protagoras comes from later sources. This is of course not uncommon, and we have seen this already with most other pre-Socratics, but in this case Plato's dialogue, called Protagoras, is a major source for his philosophy, and, as we shall see, Plato is perhaps not as unbiased as we might hope. About his philosophy, it was popular among pre-Socratics to study math. Most famous for this was of course Pythagoras. But Protagoras did not like it at all. He allegedly said about math that the subject matter is unknowable and the terminology distasteful. Instead, Protagoras was thinking and teaching about topics related to virtue and politics, and one of the questions he wrestled with was whether or not you can teach someone to be virtuous. This seems like a trivial question, but you might be surprised when you read Plato's dialogues, when this topic is discussed in much more detail. According to secondary sources, he also worked on questions of grammar and rhetoric, analyzing speeches and writings and beginning to formally classify different types of speech, like questions, answers, assertions, commands, etc. Let's now turn to his two most famous contributions. His most famous quote is the following: "Man is the measure of all things, of the things that they are, of the things that are not, that they are not." This is a very thought-provoking statement. What could he possibly mean? Is he perhaps trying to say something about reality, like if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one to hear it, did the tree really fall? Or is he saying that facts without interpretation, by a human, don't have any meaning, but they just are? This can perhaps be applied to our senses, which are both objective and subjective. We can both weigh a stone and a feather. And we will likely all conclude that the stone is heavier than the feather. But is the stone itself heavy or light? To a strong man it may appear light, but to a baby it may appear heavy. But what if he also intended to apply this to matters of morality and politics? This could then challenge the idea that there is an objective morality that can be deduced by logical reasoning, like Parmenides did, or revealed by divinely inspired poets, like Homer or Hesiod. Theology. When it comes to religion, he appears to have been a maverick. A couple of videos ago, we saw that Xenophonus had argued that the gods people worshipped looked suspiciously human, and Anaxagoras had argued for a mind that had set all of reality in motion at the beginning of time, yet he had not committed to this mind being some kind of creator god. Protagoras was of a similar mold, though he expressed himself somewhat cautiously, and some would therefore call him agnostic. Here is the way he opened his book called On the Gods. "Concerning the gods, I have no means of knowing whether they exist or not, nor of what sort they may be, because of the obscurity of the subject and the brevity of human life." Some have suspected that this agnostic or perhaps even atheistic view made him some enemies, and there are old tales of his banishment from the city and the burning of his books. However, modern historians doubt whether this really happened. He sure may have made some enemies, but no contemporary accounts of open hostilities toward him are known. What these two quotes have in common, though, is a certain view on truth and knowledge. In both cases, it seems, Protagoras values both truth and knowledge, but in both cases, too, he seems to heavily imply that our knowledge may never be equal to the truth. A similar distinction between truth and knowledge about the truth was also proposed by Xenophonus, by the way. In contrast, the other pre-Socratics so far seem to have had the opposite idea. Namely, they all appear to have some idea about either being or becoming, and they all had their arguments as well. Some were based on observations, others on clever reasoning. Some were interested in the form of ultimate reality, and others in the nature of ultimate reality. Yet they all seemed to think that their way of searching for truth led to reliable knowledge about the truth. Protagoras, on the other hand, shows both restraint and humility. Knowledge is not always reliable, and truth ultimately is out of our reach. So then, should we give up on truth? Well, Protagoras never seems to have gone that far. But then, what is the point of philosophy? What's the point of knowledge? Well, you may have heard the expression, knowledge is power, or perhaps the pen is mightier than the sword. Now, these quotes are not from Protagoras, but one could argue that Protagoras would have hardly agreed with those quotes. He realized that in politics, most big decisions of what to do with a state, what laws to pass, how much taxes to raise, whether or not to go to war, all of those decisions ultimately result from debates. This is most obvious in the kinds of public democracies that were practiced in, for example, Athens. Whenever an important decision was to be made, all eligible men would gather, there would be speeches by different people, and then the people would vote. But the same is true for virtually all forms of government, though on a smaller scale. A king might want to make a decision, but first he would listen to his advisors and then cast the only vote, as it were. And something similar was and is true in courts as well, where prosecutors and advocates try to persuade either a jury or a judge of the defendant's guilt or innocence. Now, on what basis do assemblies, or kings, or juries, or judges cast their votes? Well, based on what they believe is the best course of action, right? And what makes them convinced that this is the best course of action? The best arguments? No, says Protagoras. Emphatically not the best arguments, but the most persuasive arguments. So if you want to influence politics, you must not try to give the best factual information or the best arguments that lead to the truth, but you must be persuasive instead. And the same is true for philosophy writ large. We've all seen these different philosophers and these different theories. Which one is true, or which one is closest to the truth? We don't know. But we do know whose philosophy will ultimately prevail, namely the most persuasive one, regardless of whether it's the one that's closest to the truth. For this reason, he studies grammar, for by thoroughly understanding a language, you can use it as a tool to persuade. Now, this is a more cynical interpretation of Protagoras, but it is a cynical reading that was also found in antiquity. For example, one critic, Aristophanes, said that Protagoras was able to make the weaker argument the stronger. Or in other words, Aristophanes lost a bunch of debates with Protagoras and got big mad about it. A more generous way to understand Protagoras would be to say that much of the truth depends on the perspective or frame of reference one has. An example is the following story from antiquity. During a sporting event, a competitor threw a javelin and accidentally killed a fellow athlete. Now, who is to blame for the death of the second athlete? A medical examiner will conclude that the javelin is the cause of death. The referee will blame the first athlete who threw the javelin, while the organizer of the competition will blame the referee who allowed the javelin to be thrown in the first place. The facts with regard to the event are indisputable, but if we start looking at causes and effects and limit ourselves to the question of moral culpability, things are not so clear at all. So then, in order to come to the correct or just moral conclusions, you need to analyze the facts from all different perspectives and make the strongest possible case for each viewpoint before coming to a conclusion. And yes, this includes trying to make as strong as possible the arguments for positions you instinctively disagree with. And in an ideal world, all sides would get an equally skilled and thus equally persuasive advocate which in turn should lead to the most reasonable conclusion. Two lessons can be learned from this that are quite influential still today. First, in order to obtain justice, whatever justice is, you need competent advocates. People whose job it is to convince juries or judges of the guilt and innocence of various parties. It is for this reason that lawyers are specifically trained not just to memorize the law, but also in crafting persuasive arguments. Justice can only be achieved, so goes the argument, when both parties do their absolute best to argue their case. The second thing is this. Laws should be written in such a way that they benefit the country, or in Protagoras' day, the city. Meaning that when you draft a law, you should consider all sorts of possible applications and implications, and they should be based on real-world scenarios, not purely theoretical ones. Now, this all may seem rather obvious to some of us, but it was a radical and new idea for the ancient Greeks. They believed that laws were divinely ordained representations of absolute justice. That is, a city should adopt those laws that would reflect the divine order. Protagoras instead focuses on the practical benefits that laws should have for the city. And in order to better understand what sorts of laws benefit the city, one should listen to the people of the city itself. The people who will be most immediately affected by the laws should have a say in what those laws should be. Not lofty kings, no distant gods, but the people themselves were in the best position to determine what the laws should be. This makes him a radical democratic thinker. At this point you might be a little confused. You might think that this all sounds very nice. Pro-democracy, in favor of freedom of speech, people accused of a crime receiving a spirited defense. What is wrong with this? Why did he and his fellow sophists get such a bad name? Well, there are a couple of different reasons for this. For one, Protagoras was a strong proponent of democracy, but Plato seems to have been thoroughly disillusioned by it after his teacher Socrates was condemned to death by the democratic assembly. He therefore believed that he should rule as a philosopher king. Another reason is that there were many groups, including some philosophers, who believed that the laws of a city should reflect the heavenly realities first and foremost. To suggest that the human realm should reflect human concerns instead of divine ones was seen as blasphemous. Keep in mind that large sections of the population truly believed that once a city stopped worshipping the gods properly or sufficiently, that city would be punished by calamities. Thus, to suggest a radically different basis for laws was to invite divine retribution upon the people. And there are probably some people listening to this video right now who would fall on either side of this divide as well. Should the laws of a state primarily be written to benefit the citizens or residents of that country, or should they follow a higher standard, be that a holy book like the Bible or the Quran, or perhaps something more abstract like the natural order of things? There's a good chance that when you turn on the TV or browse the internet, you will find both pro-Protagoras and anti-Protagoras arguments repeated by politicians, pundits, and influencers. The debate he started is still ongoing. Thanks for watching. If you want to support me on Patreon or become a member on YouTube, follow the links in the description so you can see my videos early, vote on topics, ask questions, and more. Our next video will be about another older sophist, Gorgias, the father of rhetoric.